let's paint a loose watercolor study. And I picked an iris flower for this purpose and made a tutorial for you. I hope to give you some inspiration and tips on how to handle similar subject with watercolor, but of course you can be even more playful than I was and you can choose any flower and any color combination that you wish. Let's get us started with a simple sketch, nothing too complicated. I just went with a mechanical pencil and made a couple of light marks to position 2 flowers on my paper. Just make sure that you are sketching lightly. We don't want riffles in the precious watercolor paper. If you're a little bit like me, you're going to want to erase a bit and correct the line here and there. So make sure that these lines aren't too bold before you have everything where you need it to be. Once you feel that all is in its right place, you can grab a kneaded eraser and lighten the sketch with it. From this point on, I commit to the lines that I established. I make them a little bolder, maybe neater, and I may add some shading just to help me see which parts need more contrast. So there's that, and we can start splashing paint all over the place. When we say paint loosely, it doesn't necessarily mean paint without any rules. We would like the viewer to recognize that flower in there, and so some rules must be applied in order to achieve that. For example, some of these petals are in the light and I need to preserve that. I'm doing my best not to let the paint bleed inside those areas. I think you can already recognize the areas that I'm avoiding with my brush, and if you make sure that the surface isn't soaking wet, just like damp, then the paint will not bleed as much as you think it would. Now I think is the perfect time to also draw these tiny little veins. You don't have to do it everywhere, just pick an area that's like the focal point of your painting. For me it's that mid area, but I also drew some of them to those side petals. I will probably later cover them up with paint, but it just gives the petals some structure. While the surface is still damp, I can let this nice and warm yellow bleed. The iris flower has these pops of yellow in the center. Some of them show through the petals. These look great when they are slightly blurred out by the damp surface. And I also used some of the green pops in the bottom part of the flower just to establish the basic color here.
Could you hold me tight?
Watercolor can be so sneaky. It can lose up to 50%, sometimes even more, of the color vibrancy and tone once it dries. And so you really just have to get used to these changes. And this is why we build the color saturation, vibrancy, and even tone by adding multiple layers of watercolor on top of each other. So you don't have to be impatient if the first layer turns out too light. You will have lots of opportunities to add more paint on top and correct a lot. This is just the beginning, and let's do just that in this layer. I am particularly using the Winsor Violet to build some of the tone inside the flower petals and shade. This is probably the most realistic stage, I would say. I basically shade the flower or establish the tone at a crucial spot, which means that the center of the flower needs to be defined. I am just trying to distinguish between the light areas and the shadow areas. You don't have to get that in one go. And in fact, I didn't. I think I was adding multiple layers here to achieve the tone that I needed in certain areas. Yeah, because the shadow inside the flower or in the very center is going to be much darker than the shadow in that outward petal. So take your time and you can paint as many layers of this transparent paint as you need to achieve that contrast. You don't have to shade the entire flower. I literally just picked the center of the flower because I knew that the top of the flower and even some of those side petals will be part of that loose composition. let me mention the art supplies that I'm using, because you're gonna ask anyway. These are all the Winsor & Newton art supplies that I unboxed for you, I think 2 videos ago. So I will link that unboxing video down below. I purchased some watercolor art supplies, a lot of greens, then the turquoise color and Winsor violet. Those are the main colors that I'm using in this painting. And I picked 2 brushes that I also tried to stick with during this study, the rigger brush and the pointed round. And I have to say that I am not crazy about the pointed round. It didn't really work for me, but the rigger brush, that's very handy. That's the one that I'm drawing the lines with, and it was very handy for all the details. Also, this entire process from drawing until the very last brush stroke of the painting process is available on my Patreon with commentary in real time, and that lesson, along with a lot of others and a full material list, is available for you. I will link it down below. Finally, the background layer, and this is where the study finally gets a lot more loose and a lot more fun. The main goal here is to cut the entire flower from the background and then just let the colors that you selected for the background bleed into one another. Of course, the flower itself needs to stay dry because you don't want those colors to bleed inside your petals. Unless you accidentally run your brush over those petals, it really won't, it will stay in its place. This process is so enjoyable. I finally had the opportunity to use all those beautiful greens. If you are interested to see exactly what shades there are, check the swatching and the unboxing video that I mentioned earlier. But one color that I was particularly eager to try was this cobalt green deep, and also this aqua green, that's like the darker turquoise that you see the upper part of the background. And I love the granulation of the cobalt green deep, and you can really play around with color here. I use splatters, like wetty wet splatters. I don't even mind if the splatter lands on that dry part of the flower. Here is where the looseness finally gets manifested. Just play around and be spontaneous. The paper can handle anything. These little experiments might be scary at first, but they will really give you courage. You will never find out what's possible if you don't try. And if you have to, you can do smaller size studies like A4. That way you spend less time and energy to finish something that might not work, but it will still give you lots of information and will eventually build your watercolor confidence. In this part of the process, I just tried to stack the textures and layers of paint on top of each other. Every single layer would be slightly different than the one before. One of them, for example, contained the little bits of table salt, which created this beautiful salty crystallic texture that you see on the right side of the flower. And then in the next layer, I let the paint run down a little, and then splatters on top created another texture. And all these watercolor layers on top of each other will sum up into one beautiful watercolor loose expression that will essentially give the final visual atmosphere to this painting. There is still some important work to finish here. This will include tuning the contrast inside the flower to match the background, and so I'm adding more paint to the darkest parts of the petals. Visually, most dramatic change happens with final layer of the background. Here is where you can really go dark. I used my cobalt green combined with aqua green here to make sure that I can really bring out those darkest darks. If possible, try to keep the darkest paint in those key areas that will define the silhouette of the flower. There is no need to spread the paint everywhere. In fact, be careful not to destroy some of those textures that you developed in previous layers. Few more splatters and we are finished here. To sum up this watercolor technique, the goal is to be loose and expressive with watercolor textures while maintaining the basic shape of the flower and also overall distinction between light and shadow. You can preserve the highlights by painting around the areas of the light, and you can preserve the basic shape of the flower by painting around it with your darkest darks in the last background layer. Use splatters, color dripping effect and salt effect to enrich the textures and you are good to go. I hope the tutorial was helpful, and If it was, then let me know in the comments and I will see you in the next one.